We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's April 28th here in Seoul. I'm Shin Yeun, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Cheska Dainhong.
Happy Friday, everyone!
Happy Friday!
And
Nalsong.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. It's the last time we'll see each other in April.
Oh yeah, last day in April.
Yeah.
Yes.
But anywho, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. Starting with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. Now, 21 universities in South Korea, including the country's top-ranked ones like Seoul National University, will start considering school violence records in their regular admissions processes for the 2025 school year. Now, this measure follows more voices arguing that bullying should have heavier consequences. Moving on to the second story, Kazakhstan has amended its labor law so that most people will only have to work 4 days per week from July. Now, the new labor code requires every employee to rest on Sunday. The second and third days off can be determined by each company's labor regulations. Moving on to the last item, recently a video showing a 14-year-old detained at a police station in Korea went viral. It shows a boy in handcuffs kicking police officers, swearing, and trying to pick a fight. Now, this enraged many. For a long time now, the public have demanded that the age of criminal responsibility be lowered by 1 year from the current 14, considering the gravity of crimes committed by juveniles. Currently, minors under the age of 14 cannot be convicted of a crime here in Korea. Now, I saw this video too. I was very enraged. And are you guys for or against lowering the minimum age to be convicted of a crime here in Korea?
Absolutely for. And I mean, I think the issue is that they understand what they're doing. They understand, they have the knowledge of what they're doing, and they're completely unapologetic for it. And perhaps if the parents educated them at home and disciplined them saying you should not be doing this, I think, you know, it would be a little better, but it's not happening. And if this did already happen, we wouldn't be here in the first place. So yes, I am definitely for, and it's very tragic.
Yeah, and they not only understand that they're doing it, they understand that they could get away with it.
Yep.
I think that's the critical point there. But what are your thoughts on this, Cheska?
I say this with great emphasis, but the conviction age must be lowered. But that is not just the solution, and it must be accompanied by a constructive and proactive solution for these first-time, very young offenders. And Yeon, we actually discussed in the episode of the glory and high school violence about the importance of government and specialist intervention, because a lot of these offenders need to be educated and rehabilitated. Because a lot of the times it's about, as you said, Niall, it's about the parenting or sometimes, you know, very destructive household that causes these people to fall into the wrong route. So I think, again, I say this with great emphasis, the solution is not just lowering the age, but building a society where they can actually add value to the society.
Better infrastructure, better counseling programs, better education, not only for the children, but also for the parents as well.
Right.
And that was our news feed for this Friday. Moving on, we're soon going to see President Yoon's state visit to Washington wrap up. Before returning to Korea, though, he will be visiting Boston to make a speech to students at Harvard. And this prestigious U.S. school has a lot of Korean Americans. And speaking of them, we're going to be talking about how much this community has expanded since the first Korean immigrants stepped foot in the States. For more on today's discussion topic, take a look at the screen. Anything Korean may seem to be booming now, but it wasn't like that when some 7,000 Koreans were recruited and brought to Hawaii as plantation laborers in 1903 to 1905. The first generation of Koreans who stepped foot in the States had it tough. Not being able to speak English and tied down to strenuous jobs requiring a lot of labor, it was hard for many to make a living and adjust, not to mention racism. You may have seen glimpses of how it was like for previous generations of Korean immigrants through movies like the 2020 film Minari or recently released Canadian film Rice Boy Sleeps, which were set in the 80s and 90s. Years have passed, and we're seeing the third generation of Korean Americans. NewsGen aims to answer 3 questions in regards to this growing population. 1. How many Korean Americans are there in the States at the moment, and how's the community like there? 2. How has the Korean American community evolved generation after generation? Do the latest gen think they're more Korean than American, or vice versa? 3. Has the K-boom helped Korean Americans better tackle racism or identify crises? Today, we're going to be talking about how our fellow Koreans who settled in the United States are doing right now. And before we go deeper, Cheska, why don't you tell us just how many Korean Americans live in the States at the moment?
Yes, so as of last year, the estimate was about 1.92 million Korean Americans that are living in the States. I know. And that makes us the 5th largest Asian population.
No way.
Right after like countries like China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And of course, the largest state is California, with about more than 500,000. But here's what's interesting. More than half of Korean Americans were actually not born in the States, but born in South Korea.
I see.
So I think this adds, as we will delve a little bit deeper in our talk today, adds to the experience and influence of how we identify ourselves.
Definitely. And as you've mentioned, America was long known as the land of opportunity. That's why we've seen so many immigrants go there. And Korean immigration to the States can be largely divided into 3 periods. The first wave from 1903 to 49, when thousands of Koreans headed to Hawaii to work on pineapple and sugar plantations. The second wave was from the 50s to 60s, when a flux of Koreans sought refuge amid the Korean War. From then onwards, the U.S. recruited experts and professionals from Asia, and it's from this period that the Korean immigrant community started including white-collar workers. And from here, we've seen generations of Korean Americans live in the States. So now, why don't you tell us about all these? We're now seeing up to 3 generations of Korean Americans, right?
Yeah.
And I'm betting that they have different distinctive traits. So why don't you walk us through them?
You know, I think like Cheska just mentioned, more than half of the population in the States, they are not born there. So that would be the first generation and the 1.5s, as they call it. And this is not like an exact science, but this is from my observation in the past 20 years. But the first generation of Korean Americans, you know, they're obviously culturally more Korean. They struggled to settle in. English was not their first language, and they often feel strongly connected to Korea, keep up with the Korean news and things like that. But 1.5, as we call them, 1.5 Gen, are the people who moved with their parents at a fairly young age. So they had the time to kind of grow into the culture, become fluent in English. And they may have struggled to, adjust to the culture a little bit, but they have become more American than their parents.
Right.
And then there's the second generation, whole different breed.
We're moving up the ladder.
Yes, moving up. And these are people born in the States, born in the United States by definition, and they've become more American than their parents. And, 1.5, they grew up speaking English, starting with kindergarten, daycare, elementary school. They, learned English in school. So that's that. But they feel a little less Korean, perhaps, than their parents.
I'm sure.
And it's not, and if they've been discriminated against in school, unfortunately, whether it be because of how they look or the types of lunch boxes they brought to school, I think they have this big identity crisis of, am I American or am I Korean?
Right.
Yeah.
And Naya, you made such a great comment because some of the things you mentioned, I'm sure all of us do have a similar experience. But I think that's why, as of now, there are some movies like Minari and Rice Bowl Sleeves, which is becoming a sensational in the movie scene, that actually talks about these Korean immigrants.
The
And
struggles they go through.
And the real struggles. I mean, what the parents go through trying to connect with their kids who are distant because they want to fit into a more, American or foreign community.
Yeah, it's the generational gap and the cultural gap that they're trying to fill, and it's so difficult. And then there's the third generation of Korean Americans who are raised by second generation Korean Americans who had this identity crisis and maybe feel a little more comfortable speaking English at home. And so usually they feel more comfortable speaking English with their children, and now these guys are growing up and fourth generation is a-coming.
Oh my God.
We're expecting them very soon.
Yeah, but unless they make an active effort to connect with their roots and maybe come back to Korea or, stay with their relatives who are more Korean in that way, it's difficult for them to really feel fully Korean.
Right, and we're already seeing second and third generation Korean Americans take up bigger portions of the workforce in the States compared to the first gen. As Nell mentioned, they're not as familiar with Korea or seemingly connected with their traditional roots. But to find out whether this is exactly the case, we have an interview prepared with a second gen Korean American. So we're now going to be hearing from a second-gen Korean American. It's Jaden Song from Oklahoma. Great to have you here, Jaden.
Hi.
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 All right, Jaden, as I said, you're a second-gen Korean American. So why don't you first start us off by telling us when your family first immigrated to the States?
So they came to the States around the mid-90s, and they both arrived here for college. They went to ORU. My mom has a more interesting story. She had jumped from Korea, then went to Spain, then came to Korea. Then came to America right after. And yeah, that's how they met, because they met in that college. And then they've been here since then. So.
All right.
That's very interesting. Jaden, I'm sure you know, but there's a growing influence of Korean culture around the world. And now foreigners are actively choosing South Korea as their travel destination. Now, have you been back to Korea since you left? And if so, when you came back, did you still feel the connection of it being so-called your home country?
Yeah, I have visited Korea a couple of times. The last time I went was in 2014. And it was really interesting because going over there, I did actually feel a sort of connection while I was in there. It wasn't something I could necessarily verbalize as well, but when I went over there, there was a certain sense of belonging, as if it satiated this other part of my identity that I was like, there's something that wasn't quite there that I didn't know what that was until I had that put into context going to Korea.
Yeah, and I also have a question. As a second generation Korean American, I feel like you had your specific set of hardships and struggles. Can you share that a little bit?
I would say those are more in the micro sense as far as the hardships. More so in terms of, I think, as you mentioned before, in terms of coming to terms with identity, because there is that divide between, like, am I American, am I Korean, and I think that it is maintained in halves makes that a little difficult to decipher sometimes. But I think I've learned to become more comfortable as I try and, like, educate myself about it, and also and I still live family who are first generation Koreans, so it's just good to have that culture there. So it almost feels like I work as a sort of transition gap there, really.
Yeah, I understand that.
For sure, I can relate to that as well. Apart from identity crises, though, there's also the problem of racism. You know, a lot of Asian Americans or the AAPI communities going through that, especially with the advent of COVID-19. But do you think K-pop and Korean culture's boom sort of helped many Korean Americans, go around in the States or anywhere abroad? What are your thoughts on this?
I think to a certain extent it does. Especially considering the vast influence media has most of the time. I think getting Americans more exposed to Korean culture and its growing popularity. A lot of people are really invested in K-pop and K-drama and all of that. So I think that is really helpful in terms of kind of forming their perception and, maybe perhaps turning around some things that have been negatively affecting those who have been living in America.
For sure. And lastly, I'd like to ask you, how tight is the Korean American community like there? Are there any activities you've tried to help you stay connected to your Korean roots? And as Nell mentioned here in the studio, each generation seems to have distinctive traits. So are there any episodes you had at these Korean communities where you talked to 1.5 generation or the first generation of Korean Americans and found any similarities and differences?
My main experience has to do with close family or church communities in Korea. I would say those are where they are most tightly knit. And having gone there, to me, what it seems like is there's a lot of first generation Koreans in these groups. So there's a lot more of a traditional sense of traditionalism over there. And that's really interesting for me, since I'm in that middle area. but I don't necessarily find that disparity intimidating though. If anything, I find it more educational and maybe incentivizes me to learn more and maybe be more involved where I can, because in Oklahoma there aren't that many Koreans.
Yeah,
so,
right, for sure.
So
really?
you
I'm
find them where you
surprised.
can.
Oklahoma.
All right. Thank you so much, Jaden. It was a pleasure to hear from you today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
All right, and Jaden provided us a glimpse into what the second generation Korean Americans are going through, and he mentioned a great point there. Though there is differences in the traits that each generation has to offer, that disparity doesn't like break up any Korean ties that he has or like bring about miscommunication. And I was very happy to hear that.
And he even said it doesn't intimidate him, but he actually
Exactly.
feels educated, which is a great
so
attitude.
great.
It's such a great
I
attitude.
heard it and I said, I wish I felt that way when I was living overseas.
It's a very humble learning attitude to have.
Yes.
So accepting.
Exactly. Now, before we continue our talks, we are going to hear from our global viewers, and we asked them if they know any Korean Americans and whether they think they're more Korean or American. So take a look at the screen to find out what they had to say. Onju said, I'm Korean American. I was very blessed to be raised by very old school Koreans. So I'm very Korean at home and both when out. Now, Tira Bell says, one of my friends is Korean American. She was born in Georgia. However, she grew up mostly in Gyeonggi-do in Korea. So I definitely say that she's more Korean than American. And Channy D said, I'm a second gen Korean American. My dad is a 1.5 gen. Mom is first gen. Best part is I can interact and understand both American culture and Korean culture together. Worst thing is, Koreans will never accept me as a true Korean, and Americans will never see me as a true American. You know what? I think Channy D's comment really got to me because I could relate to this a lot. I mean, everyone here in the studio has lived abroad for a few years. For me too, I lived abroad in the States. When I came back to Korea, I was 12 years old, and I really struggled with finding my roots to Korean culture. I would speak Korean at home. I would eat Korean food because my Korean parents, of course. But when I first came here, I didn't know any Korean.
Oh,
So I couldn't really fit in, and everyone would call me like that girl from America.
Who doesn't speak
Who
Korean?
doesn't speak Korean?
Who's bad at Korean? Yes, I've had that label too.
Exactly, and that sort of caused a little bit of an identity crisis for me as well. But what about you guys? Can you relate the problems or difficulties Korean Americans or ethnic Koreans who grew up mostly abroad go through?
With my entire being, yes and yes. I can absolutely relate to everything that we mentioned today. And I think, you know, living in 3 different countries, I really felt like a circle trying to fit into everything but circle.
That's
like,
a
it's
really
that
good
feeling-
expression.
Right? It's like everywhere you go, you are not quite fitting in. And as you can see from the photos, I mean, this is Central Park. I lived in New York. I traveled in LA. That's Times Square.
Wow.
But everywhere I was, I think I was having this identity crisis. And I think this is very common for people who don't grow up in the country that they are actually born from. And I also felt like that when I first came to Korea, I even had a mild panic attack because I was trying to run in Han River thinking it would be like Central Park. And everyone was looking at me like, what is she doing?
Yeah,
What is she wearing?
What is she wearing? Why is she, why is she running the way she does? And I think this struggle is very real for all of us. And I'm still trying to adjust. But the solution that I came up with, and I hope this helps some of our viewers, is that, you know what, if I can't be identified and if I'm indefinable, heck, I might as well just be my own category.
Right.
I'm
What
one of a
category is that?
kind.
A one-of-a-kind
One of a
category.
kind, yeah.
Let's all be one of a kind.
Yeah.
What about you now?
Definitely, fully agree with the whole identity crisis thing. Growing up abroad, I am ethnically Korean. My parents are Korean. We speak Korean at home, and I have a Korean citizenship, so I can't even call myself American despite the accent. But, you know, I think it's the percentage of Koreanness in me that I'm not really sure is, you know, fully Korean enough for people to identify me as Korean. And I think, you know, it takes a while for you to really stay here and understand which part of you is actually Korean and which part of you is not. But, you know, eventually, like Cheska said, you come to kind of accept you and yourself for who you are. And
Right.
it's a unique combination, and I love myself for it. And I feel privileged that I get to, like Shani D mentioned,
For
that
sure.
I can understand both cultures.
For sure. And you
It's a
know,
privilege.
the funny thing about identity is that you should be the own judge of who you are.
Yes.
But people around you seem to evaluate for who you to be. For instance, if you're Korean American, they'd be like, you're more American than Korean. It's not up to them to decide, though. It's up to the individual.
Yeah.
Now, the next question I have, though, is what are your thoughts on K-culture's growing popularity? And we asked this to Jaden as well. Do you think K-pop and K-culture is making the lives of Korean Americans easier in the States?
I think that's a great question, and I may be a bit biased because I actually lived in the States before this monumental wave of K-culture. So I'm seeing the before and after pretty distinctively, and I'm not sure of the exact magnitude, but I truly believe that this has actually put South Korea on the map. But not just that, but also actually making people want to be, quote, Korea. And I use that in a very general sense.
Right.
Now, even in the most amazing thing about culture is in political science what they call as a soft power, attracting people to want to be more like the country. And even in the article in The Diplomat, it said, quote, a force to be reckoned with. So influential that even read, quote, K-culture can form an approximation of hard power through music and activism that is more powerful than any missile system South Korea has ever deployed.
Wow, that's
very
powerful.
Isn't that a strong
It
statement?
is a strong statement, and Korea is becoming like a premium brand.
It is.
It
That's
is.
exactly. We are branded as a country that everybody, quote, wants to be.
I love it. But there are still efforts that need to be made, right?
Yeah, and I
what-
mean, while I do agree with the idea that it's soft power and it's actually really powerful soft power, it's the first step. It's a great first
agree.
step,
I
and
agree.
eventually people need to get deeper than just the entertainment and the media
For
to
sure.
get to know the country, get to know the culture. For for people to really say, "Oh, my struggles have been lifted a little more." Yeah, just identifying people as the type of K-pop song isn't going to resolve their identity crisis
love that
because they don't
comment.
fully understand the culture.
All right, and there still needs to be efforts to tackle many unsettled issues, for instance, racism.
Absolutely.
Helping people out
For
with their
sure.
identity crisis, but we'll have to see hate crimes and we'll have to see more efforts being held on this field. But due to time, we have to end up here now. And we'll be here every day from 9:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics that young people are talking about. Special thanks to Cheska Deinhoff.
Thank you so much. This was a fun discussion.
It was. And Nelsong.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you next week. We are News Generation.